The passage that we're in today, we're back at the temple. The setting is, last week we were 2,600 kilometers away in Macedonia, and today we're traveling back down to Jerusalem. We've been here before when we were at Mount Moriah. We've been here before when David bought the threshing floor. But now we're actually in the temple. And Jesus has been all day long talking with the Pharisees, Sadducees, legal or lawyers of the law, and that's biblical law. He's been talking to the scribes, those people who are constantly transcribing the law, making sure everything is right. And he's carrying off this conversation with them that is talking about, and literally there's arguments that have been going back and forth. You know, what do you think it would be like to argue with God? I don't have to ask that question, do I? You know what it's like. Because we do that. And they were arguing with the physical God, God in the flesh, Jesus there, and they're arguing with him. So, here, after they've been through all these arguments, Jesus goes to the side and he rests, and he sits down, and we find him in verse 41, chapter 12 of Mark. It says, "And he sat down opposite the treasury and began observing how the people were putting money into the treasury. And many rich people were putting in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 copper coins, which amount to a cent. Calling his disciples to him, he said to them, 'Truly I say to you, this poor widow put more in than all the contributors to the treasury. For they all put in out of their surplus, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she owned, all she had to live on.'" Now, this situation, we're at the court of the women. That would be where there are 13 vessels that are set up that are trumpet-shaped receivers of offering. These offerings would be daily sacrificial offerings or temple expense offerings, but either way, these were free will offerings. These weren't the tithes to the temple. They weren't the tithes expected by God. They weren't something that was mandatory at all. They weren't to be given out of duty or obligation. This was just a receptacle area where you could go and give your free will offering so that the temple could be run and that everything else would be taken care of. We find that this is where Jesus is sitting. He's sitting just opposite of the treasury there in the court of women. But right beyond that would be the court of men, and beyond that would be the area where the Holy of the Holies would be. And so the women couldn't go where the men were. They couldn't go in any further. The men couldn't go in to where the Holy of Holies was. It was this location in the temple. All the arguments and all the questions had been happening in the court of the Gentiles, where the religious leaders of the day had been making a very big public spectacle of this whole confrontation with Jesus. But here Jesus is sitting there, and he's observing what's going on. Now, how many times in your life have you said, if Jesus were here, I would, or if Jesus were here, what do you think? You know, Jesus was there. He was observing everything that's going on. And here's one thing I want us to know. Jesus is here. He's here this morning. If you're a believer, He's with you every moment of every day, everywhere you go. You don't leave Jesus behind anywhere. So when you sit there and ask, what would Jesus think about this if He were here? He is here. And He's observing what's going on in your life and in my life. He knows what's happening in your mind and in your heart and in your actions. He knows all of that. And He's sitting there and He's watching what's going on. Now, in the English, it says, he's watching what the people are doing, how they're putting their offering in. And it just looks like, okay, he's watching how the rich people put theirs in, how the poor people put theirs in, how just the ordinary people put theirs in. He's watching this whole process, and it looks like it's all the same, but in the Greek it's different. Because it says, some of them are putting in large sums of money. How in the world would you know that they're putting in large sums of money? Nobody's coming up there and announcing, okay, I'm giving this much and putting it in. It was trumpet-shaped vessels. The trumpets weren't there to project the sound, but it was there to make it easy to give. But it says most people would walk by and put their offering in. Some of them, it was just that placing. But some of them would throw their offering in. And it would make that loud sound, and you would know it's a large gift. And as a result of that type of terminology, some people take this, and I've heard some preachers talk about it, and it's the idea of, Jesus is looking here and he's condemning those rich people because of the way they're giving their offering, and he's praising this poor lady because of the way she gave her offering. That's not what this is about. Matter of fact, in this passage of Scripture, Jesus doesn't condemn anybody. Not at all. The large sums of money are necessary. They're needed. The small amounts of money are necessary. They're needed. What he begins here is he says, hey, disciples, I want you to come over here because I have just witnessed the greatest sacrifice, and I want you to be aware of what this lady has done, and I want this message to get out. Matter of fact, 3 of the gospel writers have this story in their gospels, and this story continues to be shared. He's talking about sacrifice. And he says, this lady has sacrificed. She has gone all in with everything she's done. All the actions that God's seeing, he sees this and he goes, this is special. So, 3 things I want us to look at that he points out to his disciples as he calls them together. He said, this is a teaching moment. I want you to come together and I want you to see what's going on. The first thing we want to see is that the widow shows us a picture of complete trust. She completely places her trust in God. She doesn't look and say, okay, God, if you'll do this, then I'll do this. If you'll do this, then I'll do this. She's not bargaining with God on, okay, if I give $1, will you give me 10? Or you give me 10 and then I'll give you $1. Or you give me 100 and I'll give you 10. And she's not doing all of that. She's fully placing her trust in God. Now, sometimes we get in the situation where we place our trust in our finances, don't we? Because we kind of look at it and we don't worry about where our next meal is going on or going to come from. And sometimes we may not even thank God for that meal. We may just passively think about it. But in our mind, we're kind of like, okay, Lord, we don't have to worry about the meal anymore. We can take care of that. Okay, God, I don't have to worry about the rent anymore. I can take care of that. Okay, God, I don't have to take care of the transportation anymore. You don't have to, I can take care of that. And it's that idea of we are depending on that. But we need to remember all that comes from God. And here's a widow who literally had nothing. I mean, according to the Scriptures, she has nothing. She is placing her trust in God and God alone. She doesn't have any wealth to place her trust in. So God is sitting there saying, okay, what she is placing her trust in is God. She's giving this gift. She's putting in all that she owns. The others were giving out of their surplus. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Some of the others gave humbly and they gave cheerfully. Some of the others gave begrudgingly. Some of them would have given as a boast. When it talks about the throwing of the money in to make the sound, I have a feeling those were more of just a boast of, I want you to know I got something. I want you to know that I've got that. But this lady, he tells his disciples, I want you to understand, she has given her all. She is completely trusting God for everything. In Psalm chapter 9, verse 10, it says, and those who know your name will put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. And in Psalm 52, verse 8, it says, but as for me, I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I will trust in the loving kindness of God forever and ever. And a guiding passage that has been a guiding passage for many of us throughout our lives is Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5, where it says, the first part of it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. That's what this lady was doing. He pulls the disciples aside and he says, I want you to understand, this lady is truly placing all of her trust in the hands of God. The second thing we see him teaching his disciples out of this, he says that the widow shows us an example of total sacrifice. Now notice, she put in all that she had. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes we look at this and we go, oh, she put in all that she had on her. She took her wallet out of her pocket or out of her pocketbook and she turned it upside down in the offering plate and she dumped out all of her money and that's what she gave. No, that's not what this says. In the Greek, it says she gave every single thing she had. Everything. Everything she had to live on, everything she had to eat on, everything she had to hope for, everything. It was not a proportional gift. You know, some of us look today, and when we come to our commitment time, we will give proportional gifts. Some of us will give 10%, you know, because of our tithe. We give our tithe every week to the church, and we'll give our 10%, and we'll go, well, we can go just a little bit higher than that, and we'll give a proportional gift. Some of us will give 20%. Some may even decide to give 50%. Some could be like R.G. Letourneau in Longview, Texas, who a number of years ago was a wealthy industrial man who didn't follow Jesus, didn't know Jesus, got converted through a bunch of tragedies that happened in his life. He went bankrupt. He was losing his family, all of this. And he gave his life to Christ. And in that midst, he said, God, if you can live off of 10%, then I can too. So Letourneau made a commitment for all of his life that he would give 90% of everything he had to the Lord. And he did. He started universities. He started businesses. He started churches. He funded crusades. He did all kinds of things that would share the gospel message of Jesus Christ around the world. But he was still a proportional giver. He gave 90%. God was using this lady and helping his disciples understand this lady is giving it all. 100%. She's giving everything. And you know, you kind of look at it and go, 100%, there's nothing much here. I mean, the Scripture says that she gives 2 small copper coins. They're called leptos, or lepta. And they are the thinnest coin minted by the government in those days. It's the thinnest coin that could possibly be. It was worth 1/64th of a day's wage. So it was very, very small. And some people would go, well, you know, it was so small, she didn't really need to even give it. And I look at it, and if I were Jesus at this time in history, I'd have been saying, don't give anything to the church. You know why? Because, listen, it's a free will offering that she's giving. She's giving it to help with the expenses of the temple. Some of the expenses of the temple that are fixing to be paid out are the pieces of silver and all the things that are necessary to crucify Jesus Christ. I've had people in my past that say, I'm not going to give to the church, you know, Pastor, until I know where your leadership is and what you're doing and how all this works. And when we figured out whether or not you're leading in the right direction, then I'll give money. I've had people before that will say, Pastor, I didn't like the way the church was doing things in the last 3 years, so I didn't give any money to the church for the last 3 years. I've been stockpiling that. And now that I know the church is going right, then I'll give it. Listen, folks, that's a total misunderstanding. You're not giving any of this money to me. You're not even giving this for KIBC. You're giving this for Jesus Christ. That's what it's for. It's for us to be able to maintain and continue our mission to share the gospel of Jesus Christ openly and boldly throughout Hong Kong, all of Asia, and around the world. Now you may say, well, I thought it was for a building. It is. But let me ask you this. If we didn't have this building here this morning, would you be coming? Probably not. You know how I know? Because you don't go to small groups. You don't do those types of Bible studies in large numbers. So that already tells me this building creates a specific draw that draws people in, that can give people the opportunity to hear the message of God and grow spiritually and connect spiritually that nothing else will. And the building we replace it with will also. So her gift was a gift where she said, hey, I'm going to give out of my sacrifice. I'm going to give my all. I'm going to give what's available. And Jesus was looking, and He's not saying, hey, all these large gifts are bad and this good gift over here. He's saying all these are good, but I want you to recognize there is a difference in the sacrifice. She gave everything, 100% all in. Psalm 50 verse 14 says, offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Psalm 54:6 says, willingly I sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name, O God, O Lord, for it is good. The third thing I want us to see is the widow shows us where her true love lies. She's in love with God. It says, out of her poverty she gave. Out of her poverty she gave all that she had. She loved God. Now, one of the things we need to remember, again, this is a free will offering. This isn't her tithe. This is her free will offering she just gives. Our commitment to our open campaign is a free will offering that you give from the heart. And one of the things we understand is this lady may have been standing around the court or the court of the Gentiles that day. She may have overheard Jesus and His arguments as He went back and forth with some of the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the lawyers that were there. And one of the things, if you jump back up to verse 30 or verse 28, in this same chapter 12, it says, and one of the scribes came and heard them arguing, and recognizing that he had answered them well, he said, what commandment is the foremost of all? And Jesus answered, the foremost is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and there is no greater commandment, or no other commandment greater than these. So we understand that she may have overheard this message that Jesus was talking about love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. You know what? That wasn't something she had not heard before. That was something, if she were raised in a good Jewish family of that day, that was a good temple-going, God-loving family, which we think she probably was, she would have heard this phrase almost every day. She would have gotten so familiar with it that it really became meaningless. It's sort of like for some of you, you've told me that, we have the Lord's Supper every week or every month. The first Sunday of the month. And to be frankly honest, some of you and myself, sometimes I find myself, we find ourselves, okay, it's time for the Lord's Supper, so we do the Lord's Supper. doesn't really have any meaning to us. We've lost the meaning. We've lost the purpose. We've lost everything about it. And it just becomes something we do. I can guarantee you in many households, when they heard, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, it was like, oh yeah, we've heard that before. And it just becomes something we don't even pay any attention to. But I can guarantee you that day, for some reason, if she heard that, then all of a sudden it changed her heart. All of a sudden she's thinking, I do love the Lord. I love Him with all my soul. I am stunned that He would die for me. And think about that Jesus Christ would die for you. And I'm not saying you as a lot. So many times we get this idea that, okay, we're billions of people, so Jesus died for billions of people. No, Jesus died for individuals. He died for Nedra. He died for Max. He died for Simon. He died for Leela. He had you on His mind when He was on the cross. He knew every failure you would ever have. He knew every failure I would have. And Jesus died for me and you. What a great love. This lady was before that, but she knew the promise of a Messiah was coming. And this promise of a Messiah would take away all the sins. She knew more about what the sin sacrifice situation was. She watched every Passover as more than 250,000 lambs would be slaughtered, and the blood would literally flow out of the temple like a river. All for the purpose of trying to cover sin. And that was just one particular time. But sin offerings happened every day. Would you believe that there would be an offering of a person that loved us so much and was so unique that His one offering covered all our sin? What a powerful thing. You and I can love looking from this direction and say, wow, I'm amazed at what God has done. Love Him with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And I can imagine as she looks and she takes her 2 coins. She doesn't know where the next meal's coming from, but she takes her 2 coins. She doesn't know how she's going to take care of other things, but she takes her 2 coins and she places it as a free will offering of love to God. Wow. She did more. And that's what Jesus wanted them to understand. This lady sacrificed tremendously. We'll sacrifice proportionally. God has blessed us. We've been praying through this process. We've been asking God to lead us and direct us. But we're going to give proportionally. I doubt there's anybody here this morning that when you fill out your commitment card, you're saying, I'm committing my bank account, my retirement, and everything else. That's where she was. There's a legendary story that talks about a wealthy merchant in the Mediterranean that was looking for the Apostle Paul. And as he was looking, he found Timothy. And Timothy told him that Paul was in prison in Rome. And he was heading back to help with some of what Paul's needs were. And so he took this merchant with him. The merchant walks in and he's surprised by what he sees because Paul's older and much more frail than he could have imagined. But there was something about this older, frail man that was just so alive. He was energetic and magnetic. He was the type of person that when you talked to him, your heart just burst with joy. He was that type of person that just transformed the darkness of a dungeon into the beauty. And so after he had visited with Paul for hours, he came back out and he was talking with Timothy, and he says, how can this man be so amazing? What is it that's so unique about him? Timothy says to the merchant, don't you know? He's in love. He's in love with Jesus Christ. And you know, and I know, if you've been around people who fall in love with someone, if you see this boy who all of a sudden can't keep his mind on something and can't keep directed, and everything's about this girl that he likes, and he's fallen in love with her. Or the girl in the same situation that's fallen in love with the guy. And you get around them, and they're just so excited about that love. I want us to understand, this widow was so in love with God, who had provided for her, that she gave her all. This morning, I want you to realize that Jesus Christ gave his all for you and for me.